Millfield was the kind of town that looked untouched by time. Nestled between stretches of farmland and dense clusters of pine trees, it was the sort of place where people still left their front doors unlocked and where gossip moved slower than the seasons. Mornings carried the sound of roosters and old trucks starting for work. The nights were quiet enough that one could hear the distant whistle of a passing train, echoing like a memory from somewhere long ago. Nothing much ever changed, and that was exactly how the people liked it. But on a gray October morning, that peace cracked wide open. A construction crew had been sent to clear an overgrown patch of land near the old Miller farm. The area hadn't been used in years, just an empty lot swallowed by weeds and broken fences. The workers moved quickly, joking about how eerie the place looked. Then one of them noticed something odd in the dirt, a patch of soil that looked disturbed, slightly sunken compared to the rest. When they began to dig, their shovels hit something soft, wrapped in a faded blue fabric. At first, they thought it was an old blanket or maybe garbage left behind by squatters. But as they pulled it up, the unmistakable shape beneath it made everyone step back. It wasn't trash. It was human. The foreman froze, then stumbled toward his phone, his hands shaking as he called the police. Within an hour, the quiet dirt road leading to the site was filled with flashing lights, yellow tape, and the low murmur of radios. The town of Millfield had never seen a crime scene before. People gathered at a distance, whispering theories that spread like wildfire. Some said it was a hunter who'd gone missing years back. Others thought it was an animal accident. But the truth was worse than anyone expected. Forensic teams confirmed it was human remains, a woman buried shallowly as if someone had been in a hurry. The body was old, decades old, preserved by the cold earth. The discovery rippled through the town like an infection. Everyone began to question what they thought they knew about their home. Long-buried memories returned to those who had lived there in the late 90s. The strange rumors, the people who had left suddenly, the faces that had vanished from familiar porches. The Miller farm had always been quiet, abandoned since old Mr. Miller passed away. No one ever thought to look at the land behind it. Detectives from the county arrived that afternoon, taking over the investigation. They worked methodically, setting up tents, marking evidence, photographing every inch of disturbed ground. Reporters from nearby towns showed up by evening, turning the discovery into a small headline: "Human remains found near abandoned property." It didn't take long before the story became more than just another mystery. It became an obsession. The locals avoided the area entirely after that. Parents told their children to stay away, and the once busy road leading to the Miller farm grew silent again. But deep down, everyone knew something had changed forever. Millfield could no longer pretend to be untouched, and the soil that had hidden its darkest secret was finally giving up what it had kept. Buried for so long, the discovery at the Miller farm forced the Millfield Police Department to reopen old archives that had been gathering dust for decades. The small evidence room smelled of paper and stale air as officers pulled out thick brown folders stamped with fading ink. Most of the records hadn't been touched in years. Detective Laura Hayes, newly assigned to the case, began sorting through missing person reports from the 1990s, hoping to find even a single clue that matched the remains. At first, nothing seemed to connect. The missing cases were scattered across years and counties. But then 3 particular files stood out. Each had been marked as unresolved but quietly pushed aside, their investigations abruptly stopped. The names were familiar to a few older officers who still remembered the stories: Diane Rowe, a waitress who never showed up for work one summer evening; Michael Trent, a local mechanic last seen closing his shop late one night; and Leah Watkins, a young student whose family had moved away after she vanished. None of them had been found, and none had received much attention after the first few months of searching. What unsettled Hayes was how similar the details were. Each disappearance had happened near the edge of town, all within a few miles of the same back road, the one leading past the Miller farm. The reports described different circumstances, but there was a quiet pattern hidden beneath the surface. It was as if someone had been watching, waiting, and choosing carefully. When Hayes dug deeper, she realized the files were incomplete. Photographs were missing and interview notes were half-finished. One report even had entire pages removed. It didn't look like neglect. It looked deliberate. Someone, at some point, had made sure these cases would be forgotten. That realization sent a chill down her spine. In town, people began to talk again. The story had spread quickly, and everyone had a theory. Some said the grave belonged to a drifter who had been killed years ago in a bar fight. Others whispered that it was one of the missing locals, buried by a jealous lover or a vengeful spouse. But those explanations didn't sit right with Hayes. There were too many missing pieces and too many coincidences. She visited the families of the victims, hoping for new insight, but most had long since given up hope. One family had moved away and refused to speak about it. Another had stopped answering calls from the police years ago. The people of Millfield had learned to live with their silence, as if denial was safer than reopening old wounds. Late one evening, as Hayes reviewed the reports again, she noticed something odd written in the margins of one file, a name scribbled faintly in pencil. Greer. The same name appeared in another file, connected to a note about vehicle repairs. The handwriting was rushed, as if added quickly and forgotten. Hayes didn't know who Greer was yet, but she sensed the first thread of something much larger. Outside, rain began to fall over Millfield, turning the dirt roads slick and heavy. In the dim glow of the evidence room, surrounded by missing files and unanswered questions, Hayes realized the truth wasn't just buried in the ground. It had been buried in the paperwork, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to dig it out again. The name Greer led investigators to an address buried deep in the county's property records. An old cottage sitting behind the Miller farm, long abandoned and nearly erased by time. Over the years, the land had been swallowed by weeds, its fences collapsed, and its roof caved in. Most residents didn't even know the place existed anymore. When Detective Hayes and her team reached the site, they found a crumbling structure barely standing, its windows shattered and walls marked by age and moisture. It looked like a place the world had decided to forget. According to town archives, the property once belonged to a man named Thomas Greer. He'd worked as a mechanic in Millfield during the 1990s before suddenly disappearing. No missing person report had ever been filed for him. Some old residents recalled him as quiet and polite, always keeping to himself, the kind of man who nodded hello but never stayed to talk. Others remembered the strange hours he kept, lights flickering in his workshop long after midnight, the faint hum of machinery echoing through the trees. When he vanished, no one asked questions. They assumed he'd moved away like many others before him. The search team entered the house cautiously. Dust floated in the sunlight that pierced through cracks in the ceiling. The air was stale, heavy with decay. Furniture lay scattered, warped by dampness, and the floorboards creaked with every step. At first it seemed empty. Then, in a narrow hallway, a trapdoor was found beneath a worn-out rug. It led to a cellar, a space untouched for decades. The smell hit them first, a mix of rust, earth, and something faintly chemical. Inside the cellar were boxes stacked unevenly against the walls, all sealed with layers of old duct tape. When the first one was opened, it revealed what no one expected: personal items belonging to different people. A silver bracelet with the name Leah engraved on it, a set of car keys labeled Trent's Auto, and a faded photograph of a woman whose face was half torn away. Each item matched one of the missing person cases Hayes had been reviewing. The discovery confirmed that Thomas Greer wasn't just connected to the disappearances, he was at the center of them. But something still didn't fit. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of multiple victims inside the house. It was as if the cottage had been used only to store what was left behind. Greer's disappearance years earlier now looked less like an escape and more like a cover-up. As the forensic team worked through the night, more containers were uncovered, each holding traces of lives long erased. Old photographs, wallets, fragments of clothing, enough to paint a grim picture, but still no explanation of why it all happened. Hayes felt that the answers were close, but buried beneath another layer of secrecy. The house had given up its evidence, but not its story. Somewhere in Greer's quiet, lonely life was the reason these people vanished, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had made sure it all stayed hidden. As the investigation into Thomas Greer's property deepened, a new and unsettling pattern began to emerge from the old police archives. Each missing person report linked to the victims had been handled by the same officer, Raymond Blake. He had been a respected name in Millfield during the late 1990s, known for his calm demeanor and long service record. But as Detective Hayes studied his reports, something about them felt wrong. They were too neat, too brief, and all ended with the same vague note: no further leads available. For cases that involved multiple disappearances, That conclusion seemed almost impossible. Hayes requested Blake's service file. It showed that he had retired suddenly in 2001, just a few months after the last disappearance. Officially, his exit was due to health reasons, but the timing seemed far too convenient. When she cross-checked department records, she found several irregularities in how evidence had been logged under his supervision. Some case files were missing signatures. Others contained photocopies instead of originals, with subtle differences between versions. It was as if someone had deliberately rewritten parts of history. Determined to know more, Hayes tracked Blake to a small coastal town 2 hours away. He lived quietly, drawing his pension and spending most of his time at home. When she interviewed him, he appeared calm and cooperative, but his answers were strangely practiced. He claimed not to remember much about the cases, only that the victims were likely runaways or people who didn't want to be found. He denied knowing anyone named Thomas Greer. Yet Hayes noticed how his expression tightened when she mentioned the cottage behind the Miller farm. It was the first and only time his composure faltered. After the meeting, Hayes filed a request for an internal review of Blake's old cases. That was when the real evidence began to surface. The department's old storage room contained ledgers, handwritten notes documenting every item of evidence logged during Blake's years of service. Next to several of the missing person case numbers, his name appeared beside unusual remarks: disposed, returned, or lost in transfer. Some of those items matched what had been recovered from Greer's cellar. It meant the evidence had once been in police custody, then somehow ended up hidden in an abandoned property. Among the recovered belongings was one small clue that tied everything together: a crumpled receipt from an auto parts supplier. The purchase was made under Thomas Greer's name, but signed in handwriting that didn't match his own. When compared with old police forms, the signature was a match for Officer Blake. The discovery was irrefutable. Blake and Greer had known each other, and Blake had helped conceal the crimes, either out of loyalty, fear, or self-interest. The news spread quickly through the department. A former officer had not only failed to protect the victims, but had actively helped bury their stories. Hayes realized that the corruption ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The forgotten victims of Millfield had been erased not by time, but by the very people sworn to bring them justice. The excavation near the Miller farm continued for weeks under heavy security and growing media attention. What had started as a single discovery turned into one of the most haunting crime scenes the county had ever seen. Beneath layers of compacted soil, investigators uncovered 5 separate burial sites arranged in an uneven line stretching toward the woods. Each grave was shallow, as though whoever had dug them had worked quickly, desperate to finish before dawn. The remains told their own quiet stories: fractured bones, old fibers, traces of the same blue blanket found in the first grave. Each one was matched to a name that had once been forgotten in the missing person files: Diane Rowe, Michael Trent, Leah Watkins, and 2 others whose cases had never even been reported. DNA tests confirmed what Hayes already suspected. Every victim had vanished during the same 5-year period when Officer Raymond Blake had been overseeing investigations in Millfield. The final piece of evidence came from a weathered notebook found hidden beneath the floorboards of the Greer cottage. The writing was messy, uneven, and filled with short entries, part lists, part confessions. It mentioned repairs done on cars that were never picked up, names crossed out with shaky lines, and references to help from the officer. The implication was clear. Greer had not acted alone, and Blake's involvement went far beyond negligence. When the authorities confronted Blake with the findings, he remained silent at first. But as the evidence grew impossible to deny, he admitted to knowing about Greer's crimes. He claimed he had tried to cover them up out of fear of losing his career, fear of scandal, fear that exposing it would destroy the town's reputation. Yet the calm tone in his confession lacked remorse. For years, he had driven past the very land where the victims lay buried, pretending not to see what he had helped conceal. Greer's story ended long before justice could reach him. Records revealed that he had died in a hospital 15 years earlier, living under a false name in another state. He had succumbed to a heart condition, never questioned, never discovered. In the end, his death had been peaceful, a quiet escape from the crimes he left behind. Blake, however, was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accessory to multiple murders. The trial reignited every buried memory in Millfield, forcing the community to face what it had ignored for decades. When the case finally closed, the town changed forever. The land behind the Miller farm was sealed off and declared a memorial site for the victims. For weeks, flowers appeared along the fence, left by people who didn't even know their names but felt the weight of their silence. Detective Hayes stood there one evening, looking out over the soil that had once hidden the truth. She knew the answers were incomplete. There were gaps that no file could fill, no confession could explain. In the end, Millfield returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was heavier, slower, burdened by memory. The graves had been unearthed, the truth exposed, yet the sense of peace that once defined the town was gone. Beneath the surface, beneath the years of denial and fear, the buried truths of Millfield had finally spoken. Not through words, but through the silence of the ones who could never speak again.